I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
All right. Well, we are back for another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes, where we've got a part 2 here with Rich Myrick to talk in more depth about everything we couldn't talk about last time. And we wanted to start by kind of recapping the social and political and economic situation around the Ralliement, ALP, where Sion and Peter Maurin come out of. So yeah, Rich, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. Well, obviously we went in some depth last time, so I'll just summarize. But the situation, and this is a cliche, I guess, for a lot of periods of history, but it was very fluid and particularly politically, but all of these things were connected: the economic situation, the political situation, and with that, particularly in France, the religious situation, because secularism was on the rise, and not just in a general way, but in a very specific political way. By the time you get through with the Ralliement normally thought of starting 1891-92 with Leo XIII's encyclicals, Rerum Novarum, and then Au Milieu de Sollicitude, and then culminating in what I've researched most, which is the ALP, the Action Libérale Populaire Party, which started in 1901. So that's the milieu. What I would say is what this generated, particularly for Catholics, and why it was interesting to me to study, is that you have two kind of reactions to this sort of move, sometimes anti-Catholicism, certainly trying to deal with still the not lingering, the growing effects of laissez-faire capitalism, which was definitely part of life in France, Europe generally, just like it was in the United States at the time, the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, that you had reactions to this. The first one, we discussed this quite a bit last time, was of social Catholicism. That particular strain started in the 1830s or 40s in France as a reaction to industrialization. By the time you get to the period that I'm talking most about, which is right around 1900 and beyond, just that next decade, the idea by that point is to infuse social responsibility, Catholic social responsibility, into somewhat the political system, but the idea was mainly just to retain it within society, because the fear was, with secularism, that was going to no longer be a factor within society. So that was there. But this was in many ways more of a social and a spiritual movement. And so it didn't stick very well with politics. And we talked about Sion last time, about that was an attempt to merge them together, and it ended up being condemned by the Vatican in 1910. The other side of this, and this is the other side also, and both of these strains were within ALP, the party, is the Catholic Republican side, as I talk about it. This was a much more overtly intentional political approach but it wasn't just to attain political power. It was to eventually, hopefully, enact some sort of constitutional change that would protect religious freedom and other freedoms in France as they weren't at the time. So merging these two things together is where the party came from. Now, unfortunately, for those who were doing this, it didn't actually bear any fruit right away. In fact, it was considered to be a failure by the time you get to 1907, 1908, particularly. The elections of 1906 were a real downer for these folks. The party didn't go away, but the movements floundered well into World War II. So that was basically an attempt to adjust to the new reality of republicanism, that the republic is opposed to a monarchy, secularism. How do you work with that? And that's where these movements came from. But that was what they were trying to work with at the time, and it seemed like the train was moving very fast, and they were unable to sort of hop on that train. Now, the point I would make, and I'll wait for the follow-on questions, is it didn't bear fruit right away, but my argument is that it did eventually, in ways that might have actually been surprising for the founders of this party.
And briefly, what were those ways? What do you see actually working out?
All right. So what I see is World War I kind of gets in the way of everything. Post-war, sort of the next generation of those involved in these movements, both social Catholics and Catholic Republicans, and I would argue they actually came together much more after the war. There was an interesting political development because immediately after World War II in France, the conservatives won landslide victories. Some of this was because of lingering patriotic ideas, and also it was a reaction to what was going on in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution and the like, and also the instability in other parts of Europe. But this was actually a disappointment to the Catholic Republicans and the Social Catholics because they didn't get the constitutional reform they wanted, and they didn't get the labor reforms, which was really one of the big things that the Social Catholics wanted. So they ended up founding their own party, which had a lot of alumni from the ALP in it. And the development that actually happened from this is that, unlike sort of the rearguard action that it felt like with ALP in the earlier part of the century, this group, and this is that the party was known as the People or the Popular Democratic Party in French. It actually comes out to the same acronym of PDP, founded in 1924, was much more oriented towards fusing these two priorities instead of trying to go back between one and the other. In other words, they emphasized labor reforms at the same time that they were emphasizing constitutional protections. Now, they weren't all that successful generating this, but what happened, and the reason why I'm highlighting it, is because what did come out of this was a much more highly developed philosophy and an intellectual background to it than had existed before. Like I said before, it was a group of politicians who'd gotten together and were trying to form something to help, save Catholic culture within France. And now you're talking about a group that is much more experienced within politics and understands there's a give and take there, but that they actually have to have some basis for what they're doing. The reason why you don't hear much about it, and the reason why it actually doesn't get much play in French history, is because the 1930s were a very bad decade overall in Europe, and for obvious reasons, in Germany and other places, Italy gets more play, for that matter, in Spain. But it was pretty rough in France, too. It just didn't get to the level of National Socialism or fascism or anything like that. There was a back and forth, this instability that Jacques Pue, the founder of ALP I talked about last time, was warning about. He died in 1932, but his warnings were actually became reality, in that there was a massive swings back and forth between conservative governments and then socialist governments that created an instability that by the time you get to World War II, France was ripe for the picking for the Germans, and 6 weeks of an invasion in France fell. And then you ended up with the Vichy regime. So it seems like nothing happened here. There wasn't any progress, but the fact is there was, because the groundwork, the intellectual groundwork laid by this PDP party finally bore fruit in France after World War II. 1944, the party was reconstituted as what's called the MRP, the Popular Republican movement. And this was one of the major parties in France, and actually introduced for the first time truly in France a Christian Democratic Party. It also had links to Sion. Marc Saunier was actually part of MRP, as well as many of these same people who I've talked about were sort of in this interwar year period, alumni of ALP. So the lesson I see from this is that actually the seeds that were planted early were not, the people who planted the seeds didn't get to harvest them, but eventually they did. Now, again, it didn't come out exactly the way they thought it was going to come out because there were problems with the Fourth Republic. But by the time we get to the Fifth Republic in 1958, this is when the constitutional change was incorporated. So I'm drawing that line. Not every historian would, but I'm drawing that line because I see a continuity with these movements, this combination of social Catholics and Catholic Republicans that push this stuff. Probably the biggest single change that you'd see if you were looking at, say, the platform of ALP and the platform of the PDP and eventually the MRP was that, and this is a direct result of people living through the war, meaning World War I, was that they were internationalist. They were not doctrinaire pacifist, but it was definitely part of the way they thought. And they believed in internationalism, meaning, again, something else doesn't get talked about that much because it gets lost in the Nazi movement that happened in Germany about the same time. But there was a series of treaties that were signed in Locarno in Italy in the late 1920s that basically were a method that was actually, there's trying to establish what eventually became the European Union. Well, it so happens that the same people who were young men at the time who were involved in these movements were part of MRP, and these are people who eventually were part of the movement that founded the European coal and steel community after World War II that became the EU today. So these are all these links. You can see them; they're obvious, but that gets lost in the 30s, which is understandable if you know European history. The 30s is dominated for good reasons by the rise of fascism and also Stalinism and all the rest. But these were all bubbling under the surface. So those are the connections I would make. And I would argue that these things were all planted by these movements, essentially precursors of the Catholic social movement in France in this, the 1890s and up to like 1910, 1914.
Among other things, that whole narrative gives people hope, gives me hope that, even if you think that you're doing something that's kind of futile or has failed, that ultimately maybe the effort is worth it because you've planted some seeds. Before we move on, I wanted to backtrack a little bit and ask you, before and after the war, if did a division exist, a fairly strong division still between Catholics who were pro-Republican government and more like monarchist and traditional Catholics? How long did the traditional monarchists kind of hold out within French Catholicism?
Quite a while, but the war initially papered over some of those things. Because it really was a unified effort. It's known in France as the Union Sacrée, the Sacred Union, which was actually declared by the president, Ralliement as the war started. And just about everybody did get on board. Eventually, the communists left, but everybody else stayed on board. So it actually, unfortunately, I would say, gave an opportunity for those who were opposed to republicanism, I'm giving away my bias here, to become part of a legitimate movement that they held on to for a while. Now, I'm speaking specifically, it's a group that I talked about in the last time, Action Française and Charles Maurras. What ended up causing problems for Maurras is that, much like what had happened with Sion, although in a much more serious way, Maurras also received a papal condemnation. This was in 1926. And that's when his movement lost traction. Now, Maurras is you can't study the French right in the Third Republic and not run across Charles Maurras all the time. He's literally from the beginning into the end, and he's somewhat of a gadfly. Never served in political office, but he was very good polemicist, and he was a problem for. I mean, he in large part, he's the one who helped bring down Sion with it, and he had a lot of influence in the Vatican for a while until they got rid of him. But so it was still there, but within the movements that I'm talking about, I think it was the big change was that secularists, and with this, I'm really not necessarily talking about non-Catholics, but people who were dedicated to a secular republic. In other words, they were all on board with the separation of church and state, which of course was official in 1905. And so they did not want a return to, sort of a Catholic culture, Catholicism in the public square. The division there, which I refer to as
Would you
secular.
Sorry, one quick question. Would you distinguish those with what we generally call like the bourgeois revolution? That these are bourgeois characters, even if in their private lives they're Catholic, they've accepted that we're going to live in a liberal pluralist society, or would you distinguish that?
No, I'd say that's a very good description of these people. If you saw that almost across the board, that's who they are. Okay. And so they had become. They were in positions of power because they had bridged that gap themselves, but they were not amenable to what the Catholic Republicans wanted before the war. After the war, they changed, and so there was sort of a meeting of what it amounted to, and this it sounds sometimes like something that maybe a Hollywood script, but Catholics really proved themselves during the war as loyal to the Republic, to Republicans. And like I said, it's a little bit patronizing to say that because Catholics have been part of France for a long time, but by serving in the war and by essentially supporting the Republic when it was under attack, and always have to remember the entirety of the Western Front in the First World War was within the borders of France. The war was in France, and so these were people who I'll put it this way. The knock against Catholics, confessional Catholics, prior to World War I was that they would not be loyal to France because France had gone Republican. And that was no longer in play after the war. Nobody would say that after the war. So there was a sort of a meeting there that there hadn't been before. And it's one of the points I would make that this was one of the accomplishments, frankly, of the Catholic Republicans, is that they were able to legitimize confessional Catholics within the Republican system, which they hadn't been before. The war contributed to this, but this was the groundwork that was laid. It's one of the reasons I say I believe ALP was successful, because they were able to accomplish what no one else had been done before. This is what Leo XIII had intended with the Ralliement. But it took 20, 25 years for that to happen. Now, you didn't see an immediate change. They didn't change the laws that had suppressed Catholic orders or congregations. There were still very stringent limits on Catholic education. That didn't actually change until the late 50s. So you didn't get a restoration of, for instance, the Catholic educational system, which is in play in France today. It's considered a legitimate part of the system. That didn't happen until the Fifth Republic came in. And then the first government of the Fifth Republic in 1959 actually passed laws that restored Catholic education to legitimacy within France. So that's a long time to go. So things didn't change right away. And I hope I'm answering your question. It was not an immediate thing, but there was a change within. I'll have an example, and this is one of the things I did talk about in my work. It was Ramon Poincaré is one of the central characters. He was definitely one of these people you would be describing as a bourgeois conservative, but secularist. He became president of France with the assistance of ALP in 1913, and he was the president of France all throughout the war. People tend to associate the war with Georges Clemenceau. He was the prime minister at the end of the war. Poincaré was the president the entire time. He actually was term limited, and then he eventually became prime minister himself after that. France is different. You can kind of go from one to the other. He changed his opinion about Catholics, mainly because of Albert de Monts, one of the people we talked about, one of the founders of ALP, because de Meaux showed a loyalty to him, meaning Poincaré, when Poincaré needed it, and it was a personal change. And then he also saw during the war what so many Catholics had done to sacrifice themselves for the Republic. So after the war, he was like a card-carrying. I mean, he could have been a Catholic Republican himself, because he had changed his way of thinking. And this was not limited to, but this you're talking about probably for a long time the most powerful politician in France. And so that sea change with sort of that group, the bourgeois secularists. Now, he never changed his opinions about the separation of church and state. He always wanted that to remain in place. But he was much more amenable to, for instance, there was a long period of time, well into the war, that Catholics couldn't serve in ministries in government in France. It was against the rules. So this was blatant discrimination. I know I talked some about that last time. Those sorts of things were gone by the end of the war. It just wasn't. It was a major change. But again, long-term, slow change. It didn't actually really change until de Gaulle became president in 1959.
And
Yeah,
how much?
that pretty much answers my question.
Okay.
I was wondering, how much of a remnant there was of like traditional Catholics, and it sounds like not very many. So,
No.
but sorry, Spencer, go ahead.
So I get to play devil's advocate, I guess, from like a legitimist position. Would they say something like the reason there could be this like concordat between like the bourgeois Republicans and like the bourgeois Catholics is by the time you get to the both world wars, by the time the Catholics are like joining in and defending the Republic, their rigid Catholic identity has been so like buck broken or whatever that they paid their dues and now they're part of the system and they've sold out their integrity. What would you say to that?
I think that would be an argument that some Catholics in France would have made at the time. Mm-hmm. You still have, and by the way, it continues today. You have regions of France which are still very Catholic. The one everybody talks about Brittany, but there are a number of them. But I would say that's probably overstated. Because when I read what, for instance, I mentioned the PDP, this party that was formed in the mid-20s, if anything, they were much more upfront and strongly Catholic in stating that they were strongly Catholic in their motivations for what they were doing. In other words, when they would propose labor reforms, they used social Catholic arguments for that. It wasn't that they had suddenly become, bourgeois and had bought into this. They were kind of sellouts. There were undoubtedly those who were, but I think in some ways, as I was just trying to explain, there were some from the other side who would sort of come to understand the Catholic side of things, and what that reasoning was. I mean, it's difficult, I think, certainly for me, but for Americans generally to understand just what a massive change to thinking World War I caused in European countries. France, as usual, they'll always tell you this, but in this case it's true, is somewhat of an anomaly. France, in some ways, became more religious after World War II, which was not the way it was in other places in Europe, particularly Germany and Britain. The French, and some of this, by the way, was related to the fact that they had had so many losses. The French had the largest proportion of deaths in World War II. Like I said, most of the Western Front was in France. Certainly in the Western theater, they lost so many of their young men. The British talk about this, and it's true. But we're talking a couple of million dead, and that's not even counting, the flu epidemic afterwards and all the rest. So Catholics got a lot of traction because of the emphasis on natalism. And this is also, by the way, one of the reasons why, unlike most of the rest of Europe and the United States, French women didn't get the vote until after World War II, because the idea was that they needed women to be raising children. So in some ways, France became more traditional. I know we have the images of the Roaring '20s and all this sort of thing. France was somewhat of an exception to that. There definitely, Paris is Paris, and the like. But for most of the country, there was a retreat into more of a conservative. Like I said, conservatives won most of the elections up until 1936 in France, whereas that was not the case in places like Germany. And you were beginning to see a sea change, for instance, in Britain at this time. This is when the Labour Party became the number 2 party in Britain, as opposed to the Liberal Party, which it remains today. That was all post-World War I. That was not the case in France. France was more conservative after the war than it was before it. So, and that included conservative Catholicism. So if some of this seems like it's a little, hard to grasp, it's because it's an anomaly. France is, you get used to it when you study France, is that it kind of goes its own way. Now, that all changed in 1936 as the election of the Popular Front, which was a union of communists and socialists, but that didn't go very well. And then, of course, you ended up with this, I don't know, we have enough time to even talk about Vichy, but this very strange thing that Catholics were involved in, but most of the confessional Catholics abandoned it rather quickly when they realized what was going on with that. But so I don't know if that answers your question, but it's not an easy. It is a lot of gray, but I would say more so than anything else, confessional Catholicism was stronger after the war than it was before in France. Maybe not the kind of the kind of Catholicism that it had been 200 years before. There had been some accommodation for republicanism, but I wouldn't say it was anyway was waning at that point.
And so you talk about how this was in part, this was like an international movement. Where do you see, I don't know how much you've read up on Maurin and the Catholic Worker. I mean, I know you were reading his biography. Like, do you see Maurin as like basically shrapnel that came to America and kind of carried this on, or what's your, how do you view it?
Well, the more I read about Peter Maurin, the more interesting it is, because I definitely see the similarities. But I think what I would say in terms of how Maurin was received and how his ideas were received in the United States has more to do with the United States than the fact that he came from France. And the way I would explain that is this. There were many movements that were going on in the interwar years in France that were Catholic centric. I think we briefly mentioned, for instance, the personalism of Emmanuel Meunier, which did have an effect on Maurin and influence on Maurin as well. There were many others, but that one was particularly interesting because of what it reflected about the way people in France were thinking about politics and religion and everything else. The United States, however, of course, had the and this was one of the things that we wanted to talk about today, was the Great Depression. It was a very different effect of the Great Depression. I don't want to jump ahead of your questions here, but I think it actually does fit with what you're talking about or what you're asking about. We Americans have an idea of the Great Depression, which is, it actually did start in the United States, or the 29 crash and a lot of the things that happened with that. The effects in Europe were actually very different depending on what country you were in. Germany was immediately affected very much because it was tied to American banks. The German government had borrowed so much from American banks. The Depression hit Germany very hard, very fast. And of course, this was one of the downfalls of the Weimar Republic. France didn't really feel the effects of the Great Depression and really not the Great Depression itself. It was more the worldwide depression, to the sort of the ancillary effects of that, because France was still recovering from the war, was developing its own industries, and had stayed away from American banks, which actually was very wise. But by 1933, you were seeing some effects, and that's what actually caused some of the instability that I'm talking about within the swings between left and right in France. When I look at the United States, the American reaction to this, and of course it wasn't unanimous, but the United States generally moved into, and this is under the leadership, obviously, of Franklin Roosevelt, a reformist mindset. there was back and forth for a while, but then it was, okay, we're going to take a new approach to this in order to deal with these problems, which eventually became the New Deal, and so many reforms that happened in the United States in the 1930s. That's not what was going on in Europe. There was more of a bunker mentality in Europe. And of course, some of that led to things like National Socialism taking control in Germany and the Franco regime, and then eventually, the outcome of the Spanish Civil War with authoritarianism there. And then Italy, of course, with it, which Mussolini had been in power since the early 20s, but it reinforced those things. A very different reaction in the United States. So when I look at what Meunier and for that matter, Maurin and others were bringing to the United States at the time, I see it as being a place that would be more receptive to that kind of thing. Because there was already a reform mindset. There was an idea that maybe we need to try something new because what had happened before ended it catastrophically. And that's more, Americans, even at the time, tended to have a more optimistic view of the future, that we could actually maybe fix this. So when I see what Maurin brought, I don't know if that would have been as received as well. In fact, I would guess not in France, even though you had these movements that were there at the time because of these wild political swings, things that weren't happening in the United States. The United States, in ways that are sometimes hard to understand, was actually politically stable during the 1930s. And I don't want to go too far outside of my lane because, the Americanists will get mad at me because I'm talking about United States history. But these are things I think that are very well understood. And that's why I would look at it. When I look at Maurin, I look at the thing like the Catholic workers movement, it fits very well with things that were going on in the United States. And the idea that there are ways that we can improve things, that maybe, take a different approach. I can't see that having the same. And the other part of it is, I would say, as far as we'll say what Meunier was coming up with, and I think I see some of this in Maurin, and please correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not an expert, is that it's not utopian. It's not this idea that everything is going to be fixed right away. It's more that we have a responsibility, whoever that we is, in this case it'd be the Catholic workers movement, to mind our own store and our own business and take care of our own communities. It's more of a grassroots, ground up thing. And that was obviously not the way things were going in Europe at the time. Everything was top-down, state control, and France was fighting back and forth about how to do this. And of course, they ended up with exactly that with the Vichy regime during the war. So there's a real dichotomy, the difference between the American approach and probably I would say the reception to these ideas than what you would have seen in Europe, even though the ideas came from Europe.
Spencer, do we know why he decided to move to the United States from Canada? Because he moved to Canada in, I think, 1909-ish. And, he was there for quite a while and just trying to kind of live his life, working as I think a logger and just manual labor. And then he came to the United States. I can't remember.
He tried to homestead, and then that didn't go well. But
right.
I don't know. I thought there were like visa and passport issues, but I don't know. It's been a long time since I read a biography.
Okay. Yeah.
As I recall, Canada was very amenable to homesteading, especially in the prairie provinces. I believe he went to Saskatchewan, if I remember correctly.
And then his partner died.
That's it. Yeah. But he didn't immediately leave Canada, but I thought it was interesting because I believe he did go almost directly to New York, right? I think that's the first place he went in the U.S.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I've ever seen an explanation as to why he chose to do that, or why that was his next move. And I know he was in touch with publishers, and that's how he and Dorothy Day end up meeting. Is that a publisher, says to him, "Oh, you need to meet this woman," but why he was in touch with publishers at that point, I don't know.
I think he was trying to promote his ideas.
So he would have made that contact first.
That's my understanding.
At a time when you could do that, now, oh no, you could not just walk up and say, "Hi, I'm Peter, I have some interesting ideas," but yeah, okay. Yeah, so he ends up there, and what I hear you saying is he finds a more kind of amenable context where there would be more openness to these ideas of
Mhm.
grassroots work, not just like the government getting the government to change, but actually doing things at this ground level.
That would be my perception of it. And of course, there were other uh, European thinkers, intellectuals who were coming to the United States in the 1930s for a variety of reasons, mostly to escape the Nazis. But
Right.
the list is long, and I know in the field of economics, I think about, that's when a lot of the folks, some came later after World War II, but the Frankfurt School and the Austrian School all showed up pretty much at the same time with two very different views of what economics should be. And of course, the FDR administration was very much affected by Keynesian economics, which of course British in origin. So all these ideas were coming across the Atlantic, and so it's just this idea, well, we're willing to try something else, and there would be people obviously who would be amenable to starting a new life in a new way, because so many people had lost their livelihoods during the Great Depression and throughout the 30s. So I just see a more receptive audience. I don't have the data to support that, but that's what I would see. Certainly more than in Europe, where things, if anything, were closing to new ideas, and as things were getting more and more. Well, the outlook was much more pessimistic by the time you get to the late 30s for fairly obvious reasons.
Sure. Yeah. So it sounds like maybe Morin's somewhat unique contribution to the American scene or the North American scene might be the focus on direct action as opposed to government action. Because prior to leaving there, the movements that he was associated with were about changing the government or, situating Catholics relative to
Mm.
the government. And then he comes here and starts off on this program that I think, I mean, we only have the easy essays basically, but he's inspired by the Irish monastic, response to the crumbling of the Roman Empire and sort of like the preservation of the Irish church and the methods that they use. And he translates that into the current moment and emphasizes, we need to start up these houses of hospitality. We need to start up these
Mhm.
farms for self-sufficiency. We need to, very importantly, get ordinary people thinking, which he did take from Sion and from other things going on in France that, but but it sounds like in France they were still aimed, especially towards, as these movements developed, towards political action at that higher
Mhm.
level. And here, not at all. What do you make of that?
Well, I find it interesting, and it keep end up looping back to Sion, the Le Sion movement, because as you were talking about that, and I definitely made the point, and I'll hold to it, that Sion became much more political. It didn't start that way, and when Morin initially joined the movement in 1903, it hadn't been overtly political, except maybe some of the things that Saunier was doing himself. It was educational, it was spiritual, it was these small circle, these educational groups. It was only when it became more overtly political, I talked about last time with the establishment of Grand Sion, the idea that you would open it up to non-Catholics and everything else. That's about the time Morin left the movement. So in a way, he was what I see when I hear you talking about and what his writings are about. He in some ways is preserving what Sion had been and bringing it to America in a way that Saunier didn't. Now, I will say this, to be fair to Marc Saunier, he left politics in the 20s. He got disgusted. He had actually joined one of the mainstream parties, and he didn't much care for what was going on in with that in the 20s. And he left politics completely. And interestingly enough, he's actually known as one of the founders of the hostel system in Europe because he established a network, kind of a different way of doing what he had done before, of hospitality centers for the poor and for people who were traveling all over Europe. And he did that for about really up to the point the outbreak of World War II. And he didn't get back into politics until after the war, when he joined this Christian Democratic Party, MRP, and which he was a part of, and he's actually considered an honorary president of, when he died in 1950. So Saunier didn't leave the scene, but in a way, what you're describing, what I'm hearing, is that Peter Maurin sort of took those original ideas that Saunier had, at least the sort of grassroots and education and hospitality from those early years of Sion. And when eventually did come to the United States, that's one of the things he infused into this movement.
Yeah, I think so. And it sounds like Saunier even, remembered it, or did not totally abandon it. That is a really cool connection that I'm sure I didn't know about. Yeah. Wow.
Saunier is very well remembered in France. He's people kind of forgive him for the walkabout he went on at the end of like 1909, 1910. He certainly was not ostracized by the Catholic community. And part of it was because he immediately disbanded Sion when Pius X said disband it. And he said, I'm okay, I get it. And I think I mentioned briefly, it was Léon Harmel, who died only a couple of years after that, who actually helped to kind of rehabilitate Saunier after that event, because Harmel had a lot of gravitas within French Catholicism because of all the things that he had done with his movement leading up to that. But yes, I didn't want to leave the impression that Saunier sort of just fell off the map. He didn't. He went in a different direction. He was chastised, and it was very different, for instance, say, from a Charles Maurras, who, when he was condemned in 26, essentially said, the Pope's out to lunch, I'm not going to follow him anymore. Of course, he wasn't actually a Catholic, so that's the other. You have somebody leading a Catholic movement who wasn't actually Catholic. That the Action Française is a very strange thing. So there's a whole nother thing. But that movement didn't go away, but it definitely fizzled after Pius XI condemned it in 1926.
So I think at the beginning of our first podcast, you mentioned you were interested in the counter-revolutionary tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just briefly define what that means and what that interest and perspective, how that looks at everything we've talked about?
Well, I'll start by saying it. My early definition of counter-revolutions was completely military, and as I studied it, I realized that's just a small part of it. Counter-revolutionary movements tend to be conservative, and they can often be reactionary. But what you'll find is a strain of this, and I will say this is particularly in line with counter-revolutionary movements that are inspired by Catholicism, is that they have a social and religious foundation that opposes revolutions because of the destructiveness of revolutions as they see them. So the idea that revolutions, and this is, of course, very much experienced in France, and so that tends to be the way counter-revolutionaries in France think, is that revolutions, by their very nature, just throw out everything. They throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that ends up being less stable and problematic going forward. And the French definitely remember this from their revolution. The French tend not to like revolutions for that sense, even though they still consider France to be a revolutionary state. It's an interesting sort of, it's not hypocritical necessarily, but it's a dichotomy. So what I view as counter-revolutionary is those groups, those peoples, those movements who, for whatever their reason happens to be, see in a revolution the erosion of very important parts of their society. And the sort of the marquee one in France would be the Vendée Rebellion, the Peasant Rebellion during the French Revolution. There were other pushbacks against the French Revolution. And this was actually, there are several inputs to it, but the main reason for it is that the revolutionary government, what eventually became the First Republic, had instituted a law that placed all clergy under the state. And there were a number of priests who rejected this for reasons I probably don't need to explain. And so the revolutionary government, the First Republic, essentially arrested them and caused all sorts of problems for them. This didn't sit well with your Catholics out in the countryside, the rural countryside. And so eventually, among other things, this prompted them to revolt against but basically, when they started carting away their priests, they decided enough is enough. This is not what we signed up for. Because most of them, by the way, peasants, supported the revolution at first for, doing away with seniorial privileges and all those things that they very much agreed with. But they had never agreed that this was going to basically mean that they were not going to be able to have the religious freedom that they had been accustomed to, and that it would interfere with their customs and traditions religiously. So it's not a rejection of change. It's a rejection of change that impacts something that's a high priority for them. So that's why I see the heart of these counter-revolutionary movements. Now, there are obviously others that are just completely reactionary, and that would be, say, what the nobles were doing during the French Revolution. They just didn't want to lose their privileges. And eventually didn't want to lose their heads. So most of them, of course, were able to flee the country, whereas the peasants weren't. So there's a sense of almost abandonment by the nobles who left the country, as opposed to the peasants who had to stay and fight. Now, the Vendée Rebellion was brutally suppressed. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed by the men, women, and children by the revolutionary government. Still something they don't like to talk about in France. So the lesson was, if you go against the revolution, you're going to have problems. Alexander Solzhenitsyn actually referenced the Vendée Rebellion all the time when he talked about what had happened in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, and then well into his time with the Gulag. So it had resonance well beyond France. I'm not sure if I'm quite answering your question, because it's a very broad question. It's a very good question. What I initially wanted to study was like I said, the military aspects of this, and I began to realize that's probably the least interesting part of this. Although I'm still interested in some of the military stuff, but is why people would take a risk like this, because revolutions are very, very bad things to try to go against. Because when the rules start getting thrown out, then everyone is a potential victim of this thing. It gets very bad. Civil wars are very bad. Revolutions are very bad for your common people. So a lot of time those go together. A civil war is part of a revolution. And there are people who would term the Vendée Rebellion as a civil war within the revolutionary period.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess reading your dissertation, because I too have an interest in like both counter-revolutionary and revolutionary politics, because to fully put my cards on the table, I don't like liberalism. Like, I feel like it's this weird, contradictory, lukewarm kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which maybe doesn't make me a good American, but that's another thing. Reading your dissertation, it's interesting to me how people that, if they live 50 or 100 years before, maybe would be counter-revolutionaries and or reactionaries, but they hear the call for ralliement, or they think it's prudent to call for a ralliement, and then it's okay. Now let's accept the bourgeois revolution, and as long as we can still be Catholics, in this instance we're talking about. To me, it's just really interesting how people can make that shift. I don't know if there's a question there, but it's an observation. And what do you say?
No, it's something that I had to think about quite a bit. I didn't answer that question, obviously, in my dissertation, but it's a question that lingers. And I was thinking about this as I was going over some of the notes for the questions you all were asking and some of the things that came up last time. By the way, you wouldn't be the only person today who questions the efficacy of liberalism going forward for a lot of reasons.
In Catholic circles again, like post-liberals and.
Well, I can tell you in Protestant circles, a lot of that's going on as well. So I think, ironically, for some of the same reasons. But for instance, bringing up Meunier, and I'm going to keep talking about him, I guess, and until I get people to read him. He was also opposed to all of these systems. I think he, not unlike a lot of thinkers today, he sees all of these movements, whether they, political, whatever, whether it be some sort of fascism or communism or socialism or liberalism, they're all various forms of state control systems that came out of the Enlightenment in some way or another. I think it's a very generalized way of looking at it, and it can be argued, obviously. But Meunier didn't trust any of them. And so that's why personalism focused on individuals within their communities. Because once you get to a certain level of a state, whatever the system is that's actually running it, there's no accountability in something like that. I think that a lot of people would argue that point, and I would be one of them. The bigger the state, the smaller the citizens, kind of thing. And yet you're supposed to have loyalty to the state. Liberalism does that Liberalism is as wedded to that as anything else. I think with liberalism, you're talking about this idea of a neutral public square. That's one of the things that's a big deal. That was something that I think a lot of these folks that I'm talking about in my dissertation, whether Pew or DeMont or any of the other ones, had to kind of swallow hard and accept. The idea being that you could at least survive as a Catholic in a system that allowed that, as opposed to one that was directly basically so secularist that they didn't want to allow any religious observation at all. Mm-hmm. I think if Pew was looking at it now, he might have second thoughts about the direction he went. I can't get into his head, and obviously he died a long time ago. But where we are now, as opposed to where they were at the time, it was hard for me not to look at it and think he had an awful lot of faith in the system of liberal government that he might not have now. Now, again, what's the best system? What do you have to work with? It's a long-term thing. Again, you plant seeds, you might not be able to harvest them. You have to do the best in the situation that you're in. These things are not going to change right away, and the options aren't good. Evolutionary options take a long time. Revolutionary options are extremely destructive. They always have been. So how do you do this? Well, yeah, I don't know. One day at a time, I guess that's the way we have to do this. But I think if what you're getting at is in hindsight, say if these folks could be here now and look back and see what actually happened with what they were putting together, I think in some ways Pew would actually be pleased with the fact that the Fifth Republic did incorporate some of those freedoms that he wanted, and that there's been somewhat of a revival of Catholic practice in France. But it's not, I think, the vision that they had of a society that was based on essentially Catholic morality. That's not the case. And in France today, you don't talk about your religion, and that's not what they had in mind, I don't think.
Interesting. So thinking on Maurin again, and where we left off, he was in New York and he met Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day had just I think she converted to Catholicism not that long before they met. He catechizes her into, Catholicism in a more serious way, introduces her to Catholic social teaching, and then sort of latches onto her as somebody that he can work with to bring his ideas to fruition. So they form this partnership. But Day came from a different type of background, really different type of background than Maurin. Maurin, as you described really well last time, was this, from a very rural peasant background. day was kind of prior to her conversion, a pretty sophisticated urbanite type that was, into a lot of leftist politics and labor protest and things like that. So they weren't a perfect match, but somehow they worked together, with occasional, I think, disagreements. So it reminded me of the sort of like the practicality that they're talking about here. And I know that you're not a Dorothy Day scholar, none of us are, but what are your thoughts about that? Just the fact that this partnership happened, that they come from very different worlds, in some ways, very different ideas of how to get things done, right? And yet Maurin sees her as more or less the person to work with to get this project of his off the ground, and they do a pretty good job. She's more of a journalist type, she really works the Catholic Worker newspaper. She's into anti-war protesting later on and so on. In fact, anti-war protesting in World War II gets her into serious trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And they lose quite a few people from the movement as a result. But anyway, like I know you're not an expert on any of this, but I'm just kind of curious, like considering the background that you do have, what do you think of this American phenomenon and these two people coming together like they did?
There's two things that come to mind. The first one is it's not an unusual thing for people who have maybe in the end similar goals, or they're aiming for something very similar, who maybe come from different backgrounds but have very different, I'll just use the modern term, skill sets. Mm-hmm. I think Maurin could definitely see, and just the way you're describing her and what I do know of Dorothy Day, she had connections and a skill set that he didn't have. But he could bring something to the table that she didn't have, both the Catholic background, but also maybe a grounding in exactly this, Catholic social teaching, yes, but kind of a Catholic morality behind this, a justification for it that went beyond a more simplistic explanation you would see coming from, say, the political left or the political right. It's deeper than that. It's stronger than that. It has very, very deep roots, something that I'm guessing, not being a scholar, but of Dorothy Day, she might not have been exposed to before, particularly if she'd not been involved in that kind of community before. And it sort of opens your eyes, I think, to a world that you hadn't seen, and possibilities that what you're doing has a direction that maybe you're not just fighting against something, you're fighting for something. And I think that's the kind of thing that Peter Maurin would bring. The other thing is, I mean, his life story is incredible. I mean, just how you've already talked about it, how he ended up where he was and was able to make the impact that he did. It wouldn't have been promising several places along the trail. So it takes a perseverance and a gutsiness in order to get there, and kind of an audacity too, in a way, to just essentially walk up to her and say, "Okay, we're going to work together." You call it providence, call it what you want, but that's something that is very striking about this. I think, yeah, probably the first thing I thought of was these are two people who needed each other in order to, that partnership was necessary, because individually they would not have been able to accomplish it in that way. And the second thing is, I think Peter Maurin, he came from a different country, he came from a different culture, but I think he could see something in the United States, which he chose to come to, that you could possibly actually make something out of this in a way. There's possibilities in the United States that I know Americans tend to take for granted, and it's not easy. Things don't happen easily, but there is an openness to some of this sort of thing, at least in some quarters, that he wouldn't have received in France. Even if he'd gone back and all was forgiven and he was no longer AWOL from the French army, it wouldn't have been received in the same way. It wouldn't have been taken seriously. There's a possibility, especially in a place like New York and in the 1930s and 40s, and it's a different sort of there's possibilities that we can actually make something happen with this, even if it seems like a foreign idea. I could see that as being an attraction to it, but no, it's anomalous. You look at it, the odds of this happening has got to be astronomical, but there it is, and you ended up with a movement which is continuing today.
And so we should probably start wrapping it up. I guess, do you personally, what lessons do you take away from anything we've talked about? Does it in some way orient your life politically or otherwise?
Yeah, what this has done, if you're asking me, personally, what this discussion and what, being involved in this, are you talking specifically about our interaction or
like your dissertation?
Dissertation.
We don't think that highly of ourselves.
Does reading Maurin's biography change your entire life?
Right. Yes, no. What I was, if you had asked that question, what I would have said is that I see some commonalities that I didn't see before, because I wasn't very familiar with the Catholic worker movement. I'm not Catholic, and I'm not in the Catholic worker movement, but there's more commonalities out there than you might think. But in terms of my dissertation, I didn't, of course, start my program at Kansas State University thinking I was going to write this. It's something that developed over time. My interest overall, and I think I talked about this early on, is church and state and politics and religion. So I was fascinated by how this group was, the ALP and all the other movements that were going on at the time out of the Ralliement, were attempting to do something which, frankly, everybody pretty much at the time, certainly their peers, were telling them was impossible. Either there's no way you can ever make this work in a republic, or from the Catholic side, or on the Republican side, it was like, your history, you're done. This is not, you're the past. There's no resuscitating this. And yet they stuck to it, and they believed what they were doing. And none of the founders of this party saw any of this, like I say, bear fruit. But it did eventually, and that's actually not what I expected to be my argument. I was expecting actually to construct an argument that had to do about the nature of French society, French politics, and the way French viewed these things as being an all or nothing thing. You're either, when France was a Catholic country, it was all Catholic. Protestants didn't have a chance. Once it became Republican, you couldn't be a Catholic and be an active member of the society. You're either all in or you're all out. It's a 100 or 0. I thought that was going to be the main argument I was going with. I haven't completely discarded that, because I think there's something to that in French society. However, what I found was that within this attempt to do what these individuals were doing, there was this idea of, and this is something that I'm not sure exactly what term everyone would use. I think of a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien when he talked about the long defeat and tragic optimism and that kind of thing. The idea that if you know that through your faith, or in my case, it definitely be my faith, you know that the victory in the end, you still have to fight the fight as it is now, and you might not see that victory. It's the nature of it. Your part in it is to do your part, to carry the weight you've been given, and to do the work. And you just might not see the end of it. I admit I was almost emotional when I got to the end and I was reading things that Jacques Pugh was writing about in the 31 and 32 right before he died. Because he knew the way, he could see the direction the country was going, and he warned people, and he knew that things were going to get bad, and they did. And there was a part of me that wanted to say, yeah, hold on, because it's eventually going to work out for you. What you've done is going to pay off. But of course, he can't see that. And the lesson for me personally is I'm not going to see those things either, things that are important to me. I'm not necessarily going to see them bear fruit, but that doesn't mean I don't do them. It doesn't mean I don't try. I have to keep believing in what I believe and taking those actions. So that wasn't what I expected to be able to find writing a dissertation, but it's a very strong belief for me now, seeing what these people did and the faith they had in what they were doing, even though pretty much everybody was telling them they were crazy. That's a takeaway for me.
That's a very good takeaway. I like that. Yeah. I mean, for anybody who's doing, pretty hard work that isn't, that they don't see fruits from, but their heart's in the right place and they're making their best effort, they should take heart in that lesson.
Yeah, I think so.